Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take that source material, the dense stuff, the policy papers, the legal briefings, and really try to, well, cut through it for you, deliver that knowledge shortcut you need.
That's the goal.
And today, wow, we are diving deep into, well, it's one of the most charged topics out there, isn't it? Global fiscal policy, specifically the wealth tax.
Absolutely. Charged is the right word. It really hits a nerve.
Yeah, and it feels like this conversation, it's more than just numbers on a spreadsheet, isn't it? It's not just about percentages.
Oh, definitely not. It goes right to the core of things like, well, structural inequality, how political power works, and really what the future of American capitalism might even look like.
Right, and the debate, especially over taxing these massive fortunes, it feels like it's hitting a real peak right now in the U.S.
It does. There's this immediate state-level action happening that's acting as a kind of political lightning rod for the whole national conversation. It's crystallizing the arguments.
Okay, so let's frame that. The stakes here are just immense, primarily because, as you were saying before we started, this is kind of the political reaction to a fundamental economic reality. Something about $3.
That's exactly it. It often gets boiled down to that famous inequality formula from the economist Thomas Piketty.
$3.
Okay, let's unpack that right away because that sounds technical but important. So $3 is the rate of return on capital.
Right. Think stocks, bonds, real estate, any kind of investment asset, the return you get just by owning wealth.
And $D is the economic growth rate, like GDP growth.
Exactly. The overall growth of the economy, which typically influences wage growth for most people.
So what does $dollars being greater than $, what does that actually mean for this deep dive? Why does it matter so much here?
It matters because it suggests a built-in engine for increasing inequality. If the returns you get from just owning wealth, the $2, consistently outpace the rate at which the overall economy grows, $2 then, wealth, just by its nature, tends to concentrate faster than it can be spread out through things like wages from jobs. So the rich get richer, basically, just because they have the assets, and faster than the economy is lifting everyone else up through growth.
That's the dynamic, yes. It reinforces inequality, potentially across generations.
Yeah.
And so for people who support a wealth tax, this world-J dynamic isn't just a temporary blip. It's a structural problem that, well, needs a structural fix.
And the wealth tax is proposed as that fix.
It's proposed as one potential fix, yes. A way to directly address that accumulation of wealth at the very top.
Which brings us right to the core tension, doesn't it? Is this tax a necessary tool for, let's call it fiscal justice, maybe a liver, to push back against that three-jar thing? Or is it what the critics are screaming about, an administrative disaster waiting to happen, something that's guaranteed to make capital just flee the country, create legal chaos, and maybe even end up hurting the economy?
That is precisely the tightrope. Justice versus practicality, or perhaps justice versus unintended consequences. It's incredibly complex.
Okay, so here's our plan, our roadmap for you today. We're going to try and unpack three really crucial questions. First, what exactly is going on in California right now? This political earthquake, as some are calling it. Why is it happening now with this kind of urgency?
Right, the immediate catalyst.
Second, what would a bigger federal version look like? We'll focus especially on Senator Warren's plan, which is pretty detailed, and dive into that huge constitutional question mark hanging over it.
The elephant in the room, legally speaking.
And third, maybe the most practical part, how can policymakers actually design one of these things to work? How do you avoid the pitfalls, the economic and political flaws that have sunk similar taxes elsewhere? Can it be made durable?
Can it be engineered for success, essentially? Which is, well, the billion-dollar question, maybe trillion-dollar question.
Or multi-trillion, depending on who you ask. Okay, let's start where the action is hottest right now, California. Okay, California. This proposed one-time wealth tax. Let's unpack this. And the first thing that really jumps out from the source material, you mentioned this earlier, is who is pushing this. It's not the usual political players in Sacramento.
That's absolutely vital context, yeah. This isn't Governor Gavin Newsom's initiative. It's not something crafted through the normal legislative committees, not initially anyway.
So where is it coming from?
It's a direct ballot initiative aimed squarely at the voters for the November 2026 ballot. And it's being driven primarily by, well, some very powerful labor unions, specifically the Service Employees International Union, United Healthcare Workers West, SEU, UHW, they're a major force.
Healthcare workers. Okay.
And also key healthcare advocacy groups like St. John's Community Health, so you see the connection there already. This is really an effort that seems to be bypassing the established Democratic leadership in the state, maybe out of frustration.
Frustration over the state's money problems?
Exactly. The severe fiscal situation California's facing, they're basically saying, look, the usual channels aren't working fast enough or maybe aren't bold enough, so we're taking this argument straight to the people.
Okay, so they're going directly to the ballot box. What's the actual proposal? What are they asking voters to approve?
It's pretty dramatic. It's a one-time 5% levy, just once.
Okay, 5% on what? Income? Sales?
No, on net worth. The total value of everything someone owns minus their bets, their entire wealth.
Net worth, got it. And who pays? Everyone.
Oh, no. Highly, highly targeted. It only applies to individuals worth $1 billion or more.
Billionaires. Okay,
Yeah.
so a tiny fraction of the population.
Minuscule. And it's based on their net worth assessed back in tax year 2025. So it's sort of a look back.
And how would the payment work? Is it like, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Billionaire, write a check for 5% of your entire fortune by April 15th? That sounds disruptive.
Yeah, that would probably cause chaos. No, they've structured it to ease the liquidity burden. It's payable over 5 years.
Okay. Spread out, starting in 2026.
Right. So it softens the immediate blow, gives time to manage assets, potentially.
Now, the scope you mentioned,
Yeah.
this is where it gets really interesting and maybe controversial. Who does this actually hit? How many people are we talking about?
The estimates are around 200 Californians, approximately.
100 people in the whole state.
But that's it. But the list, I mean, it reads like a who's who of global tech and finance. You know, Musk, Zuckerberg, Page, Ellison. Many of the wealthiest people, not just in California, but in the world, happen to reside there or did recently.
And crucially, you flagged this, it targets their global wealth.
Yes. And this is probably the single biggest legal and practical hurdle. It's not just their California real estate or the stock they hold in a California company. It's everything they own worldwide.
Wow. So their stocks listed on the London Exchange, their villa in France, their private equity stake registered in Delaware, their Bitcoin wallet, all of it.
According to the proposal's language, yes. All global assets, stocks, bonds, private equity, venture capital, art, collectibles, crypto, you name it, regardless of where those assets are physically located or legally domiciled. If you're a California resident billionaire on the assessment date, your entire global balance sheet is theoretically subject to this 5% one-time tax.
That just sounds incredibly complex to track and value.
Yeah.
And probably easy to challenge legally.
Immensely complex, and yes, almost certainly guaranteed to face immediate, intense legal challenges on constitutional grounds, which we can definitely get into.
But before the challenges, let's talk about the why. What's the potential upside for California? Why take this massive political and legal risk?
The potential payoff is enormous. Proponents, the unions, and health groups estimate this could bring in a truly staggering $100 billion in total proceeds.
$100 billion from just 200 people.
That's the projection. Now, remember, that's over 5 years, but still, $100 billion is a game-changing amount of money for any state budget.
Put that in perspective for us. How big is that compared to, say, California's normal spending?
Okay, well, consider this. California's entire state spending on K-12 education and higher education is typically around, let's say, $50 billion a year, maybe a bit more.
So this one tax, this one-time tax on 200 people, could potentially fund 2 full years of the state's education spending.
Roughly, yes. Or think about infrastructure, healthcare. $100 billion offers truly transformative potential. It could plug budget holes, fund new programs, pay down debt. It's a massive potential infusion.
Which leads directly to the why now question. You mentioned the state's fiscal situation is rough. How rough?
It's pretty rough. Right now, California is facing a substantial budget deficit estimated around $12 billion, maybe more. These things fluctuate.
Why the deficit? Is the economy bad?
It's partly due to a slowdown in a key revenue source.
Sure.
Capital gains taxes. California relies heavily on taxes from stock market gains and IPOs, especially from the tech sector. And that income source is notoriously volatile. When the market cools or IPOs dry up, state revenues can plummet quickly.
Okay, so volatile income. What else?
The other major pressure point is rapidly rising costs from Medi-Cal, which is California's Medicaid program. Enrollment expanded significantly during the pandemic, and those costs are really starting to bite into the budget.
So a $12 billion hole now. That sounds bad, but maybe manageable. Is that the real driver for this drastic tax proposal?
It's part of it, but honestly, the $12 billion deficit is almost the appetizer. The real crisis, the thing driving the urgency from these healthcare unions, is what they call the looming Medicaid cliff.
The Medicaid cliff. Okay, what's that?
This goes back to federal legislation specifically related to the public health emergency declared during COVID, some of which was signed during the Trump administration. There were temporary increases in federal funding for state Medicaid programs and rules preventing states from kicking people off the rolls.
Right, to keep people covered during the pandemic.
Exactly. But those temporary boosts and protections are expiring. They're sunsetting.
And when they expire.
When those federal funds go away, California stands to lose an estimated $30 billion per year in federal support for Medi-Cal, starting potentially as soon as 2027.
Wait, $30 billion annually? That's not a one-time hit.
Annually. It's a structural hole opening up in the state's health funding. Compared to that, the current $12 billion deficit looks, well, much smaller. This $30 billion cliff is the potential catastrophe.
Okay, that $30 billion number is staggering.
Yeah.
What would losing that actually mean for people in California, for the healthcare system?
The projections are, frankly, devastating. Analysts across the board are warning about it. You're talking about potentially 3.4 million low-income residents losing their medical coverage.
3.4 million people.
Yes. And beyond that, you'd likely see widespread closures of rural hospitals, which are often heavily reliant on Medicaid reimbursements to keep their doors open. They operate on thin margins already.
And what about everyone else, people with private insurance?
It would likely have ripple effects, massive pressure on emergency rooms, uncompensated care costs going up, potentially leading to significant premium increases for everyone with insurance statewide. It destabilizes the entire system.
Wow. Okay, so now the urgency of the unions makes more sense.
Exactly. This is why they're framing it in such stark terms. You hear quotes like the one from SEIU UHW President Dave Reagan saying things like, "Lives are at stake. California's healthcare system cannot survive another federal cut without new revenue."
So the wealth tax, in their view, isn't just about fairness or redistribution in the abstract. It's positioned as an emergency rescue package.
Precisely. Emergency funding to prevent the health system from going over that $30 billion cliff. That's the core argument.
Okay, so that's the pro case, rooted in this looming crisis and a sense of, well, equity. How do they bolster that equity argument?
They point to the incredible gains in wealth at the very top, especially recently. The source material highlights that between 2020 and 2024, sort of the pandemic era and its immediate aftermath, California's billionaires collectively saw their combined wealth increase by over $800 billion.
$800 billion.
Yes.
Just for those roughly 200 people?
Yes. So the argument is a one-time 5% levy is simply asking them to contribute back a relatively small fraction of those enormous windfalls to help sustain the essential public services, like healthcare, that benefit everyone and arguably helped enable that wealth creation in the first place.
It's highly targeted, affects less than 0.001% of Californians. That's the pitch.
That's the pitch. Reciprocity, targeted impact, crisis aversion.
Okay, that sounds compelling. Now, let's hear the other side, the opposition. What's their immediate gut reaction?
Fierce opposition, led by established conservative and taxpayer advocacy groups like the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, which is, a big name in California anti-tax circles.
And their main argument,
Yeah.
I'm guessing,
Yeah.
capital flight.
Bingo. That is argument number 1, 2, and 3. The catastrophic risk of capital flight and exodus.
And this isn't just theoretical, right? California has seen some high-profile departures, some businesses moving headquarters, high earners leaving.
Absolutely. That's the existing trend they latch onto. Critics argue that the super rich, especially billionaires, are incredibly mobile. They have second homes, global business interests, the means to relocate relatively easily.
So the fear is you slap this huge, unprecedented tax on their global assets.
And they'll just vote with their feet. They'll accelerate their departure to states with no income tax or certainly no wealth tax like Texas, Florida, Nevada, Wyoming.
And the consequence for California wouldn't just be failing to collect the wealth tax from those who leave.
It's potentially much worse. It's a compounded loss. First, you don't get the $100 billion you were hoping for from the people who move out before the tax fully hits or who fight it legally from another state. Second, and maybe more damaging long-term, you lose all the future income tax revenue from these extremely high earners. California's progressive income tax relies heavily on a small number of very high earners. Losing even a few dozen billionaires could blow a significant permanent hole in the state's general fund revenues year after year.
They lose the goose that lays the golden eggs, essentially.
That's the classic framing, yes. They often cite the example of France's wealth tax, the ISF, which critics claim drove thousands of millionaires out of the country and was eventually repealed partly for that reason. Whether the data fully supports the extent of that flight is debated, but the narrative is powerful.
Okay, so flight risk is huge. What other major objections do critics raise?
The administrative and legal chaos, this comes up again and again.
Valuing all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Valuing non-liquid assets is the absolute bane of any wealth tax system. How realistically does the California Franchise Tax Board determine the precise fair market value year after year, or even just once, of a billionaire's massive private art collection? Or their controlling stake in a privately held company that isn't traded on any stock market? Or complex derivatives, or cryptocurrency held in offshore wallets, or, unvested founder shares in a hot startup?
It sounds like an auditor's nightmare.
It's an administrative nightmare, full stop. Critics argue it would require a vast... Right. The idea of California taxing global wealth, assets held entirely outside the state, just based on the residency of the owner, that's legally unprecedented territory for a state-level tax. Opponents are already sharpening their knives, preparing challenges based on the U.S. Constitution.
What kind of constitutional arguments?
Things like the Commerce Clause does taxing out-of-state assets unduly burden interstate or international commerce. The Equal Protection Clause does targeting only 200 people violate principles of equal treatment. Due process. There's also the fundamental question of whether a state even can effectively enforce taxes on assets held globally, relying on international cooperation that might not be forthcoming. It's a legal minefield.
So California is really pushing the envelope here. It's like a test case, a crucible for this whole idea.
It absolutely is. It's forcing a confrontation with all the hardest practical and legal questions surrounding wealth taxation.
Which logically leads us to think, maybe the state level isn't the right place for this. If the goal is to actually capture this wealth without triggering that race to the bottom, maybe it has to be federal.
That is the essential connection many policy experts and advocates make. The California experiment, win or lose, highlights the inherent limitations of state-level action. Taxing immense, mobile wealth effectively, almost certainly requires a coordinated national approach.
Exactly. Moving to the federal level immediately solves or at least mitigates that huge problem of capital flight between states.
Right. If you move from California to Texas, you're still subject to the U.S. federal tax. There's no escaping it that way.
Precisely. It avoids that classic race to the bottom scenario where states feel pressured to constantly cut taxes on the wealthy or offer special loopholes just to prevent them from moving next door. A federal tax applies equally everywhere within the nation.
And the push for a federal solution, it seems philosophically driven by that sheer scale of inequality we talked about up front, that dirge dollar thing.
Yes, the data on wealth concentration in the U.S. is just stark. The source material points out, again, that the top 0.1% of households, that's just one household out of every 1,000, now hold about 1/5, 20% of all U.S. wealth.
1/5 for the top 0.1%. And that share has roughly tripled since the late 1970s, when it was closer to 7%. So the concentration at the very, very top has dramatically increased over the last few decades.
So proponents of a federal tax see it not just as a budget tool, but as a way to counter that long-term structural trend.
Exactly. They argue that only a modest but permanent ongoing federal levy on that accumulated wealth has the potential to generate the kind of massive, sustained revenue needed for big, long-term national goals. Think universal childcare, tuition-free public college, major green infrastructure investments, things that require trillions, not billions, over time, and it provides a stable, predictable funding source, unlike volatile capital gains taxes.
Okay, so if we're talking federal blueprints, the name that immediately comes up, the most developed plan out there, is Senator Elizabeth Warren's proposal.
Correct. The Ultra-Millionaire Tax Act. It's been introduced and then reintroduced, most recently, the sources say, in March 2024. It's become the standard bearer for what a comprehensive federal wealth tax could look like.
And it's fundamentally different from California's idea, right?
Yeah.
California's was a one-time 5% emergency shot. Warren's
is designed to be annual, a permanent structural feature of the U.S. tax code, not a one-off levy. That's a crucial distinction. It aims to reshape how massive fortunes are treated year after year.
Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts, the core mechanics. How would it work?
All right. It's an annual tax based on household net worth. Similar to the California concept in that it looks at total assets minus debts.
Household, not individual.
Household, yes.
Yes.
Combining the wealth of married couples, for instance, and again, Crucially, it applies to global assets, everything owned anywhere in the world.
Stocks, bonds, real estate, art, private equity trusts, the whole shebang.
The whole shebang. Publicly traded stocks, real estate, yachts, planes, complex financial derivatives, stakes in private businesses, assets held in trusts. The definition is intended to be extremely broad to minimize loopholes.
And a really critical point here. It explicitly targets unrealized gains, right?
Yes. And this is a fundamental departure from current U.S. tax law. Right now, if you own stock that doubles in value, you don't pay any tax on that gain until you actually sell the stock. That increase in value is an unrealized gain. Warren's proposal says, no, that increase in your wealth is taxable annually, even if you haven't sold the asset. It taxes the accumulation of wealth itself, not just the transaction.
That's a huge philosophical shift. Okay, so who pays? What are the thresholds? Is it still just billionaires like in California?
The thresholds are very high, but slightly broader than the California proposal. It's definitely still an ultra-millionaire tax, as the name suggests. There would be no tax at all on the first $50 million of household net worth.
$50 million exemption. Okay, so that shields, what, 99.9% of households already?
Easily, more than that. Then the first tier of taxation kicks in. There's a 2% annual tax on household net worth between $50 million and $1 billion.
2% a year on wealth in that bracket.
Yeah.
So someone with $100 million would pay 2% on the $50 million above the threshold, which is $1 million a year.
Correct. That's the math.
Okay. And then what about the billionaires, the really massive fortunes?
For household net worth exceeding $1 billion, there's a significant surtax. The proposal calls for an additional 4% on top of the base 2%.
So a total of 6% annual tax on wealth above $1 billion.
Yes. 6% per year on every dollar over that billion-dollar mark. That's a pretty steep rate compared to, say, the Swiss model.
6% annually. Wow. So if someone's worth $11 billion, they pay 2% on the chunk between $50 million and $1 billion, and then 6% on the $10 billion above that. That's $600 million plus a bit more every year.
That's the potential liability under the proposal, yes. It's designed to have a real impact on the concentration of wealth at the very, very top.
Okay, scope-wise, how many households are we talking about nationwide? Still tiny.
Extremely tiny. Sources estimate this would affect only about 75,000 to 100,000 households in the entire United States.
75 to 100,000 households out of what, roughly 130 million households total?
Right. So we're talking about roughly 0.05% of Americans, the absolute wealthiest sliver of the population.
Okay. Highly targeted, high rates, especially at the top, annual basis, global assets, unrealized gains included. That's the structure.
That's the core structure.
But then we hit the same wall we discussed with California, maybe even a bigger wall because this is permanent. Enforcement, evasion, loopholes. How does the Warren plan propose to actually collect this money, given the immense resources these households have to, well, hire lawyers and accountants to avoid paying?
This is where the proposal gets really, really serious. The architects, Senator Warren, and economists like Emanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman, who helped design it, knew that weak enforcement killed European wealth taxes. So the enforcement architecture in this plan is arguably its most radical and robust feature.
Okay, what does that look like? More IRS agents.
A lot more IRS resources specifically targeted. The plan calls for a massive, dedicated $100 billion increase in IRS funding over 10 years.
$100 billion for the IRS, just for this.
Earmarked specifically for the creation and operation of a dedicated wealth tax enforcement division. Think specialized auditors, international tax experts, lawyers focused solely on valuing complex assets and preventing evasion by this specific group of taxpayers.
So specialized strike force at the IRS. What tools do they get?
Several key mechanisms. First, a guaranteed minimum audit rate of 30% for all households subject to the tax.
30%. So roughly 1 in 3 of these households gets a serious audit every single year.
At minimum. That's a level of scrutiny that is, frankly, unheard of currently for any group of taxpayers. The idea is to make evasion risky and likely to be caught.
Okay, high audit rate. What else?
Second, greatly enhanced international cooperation and information sharing agreements with other countries to track those global assets. Plus, improved third-party reporting requirements, banks, brokers, fund managers having to report more information about these assets directly to the IRS.
Trying to make it harder to hide things offshore or in complex structures.
Exactly. And third, perhaps the most aggressive deterrent mechanism, a very severe exit tax.
Ugh. The Hotel California provision. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave your tax liability behind.
Something like that. If a U.S. citizen renounces their citizenship specifically to avoid paying the wealth tax, the proposal imposes a one-time 40% exit tax on their entire net worth above the $50 million threshold.
40%. So if a billionaire worth $10 billion tries to renounce citizenship to escape the 6% annual tax, they first have to pay a $4 billion exit tax.
That's the idea. To make renunciation prohibitively expensive. You can leave, but you'll pay dearly on the way out, effectively locking in a significant portion of the tax revenue the government would have received over time anyway. It's designed to neutralize the flight risk, at least the risk of people formally giving up citizenship.
Okay, that is aggressive. Strong enforcement tools, high audit rates, a massive exit tax. So with all that in place, what's the projected revenue? This must be where the numbers get really big.
They do. Senator Warren's team, again relying heavily on the economic modeling by Saez and Zucman, projects absolutely astronomical returns. They estimate the tax would raise somewhere between $3 trillion and $3.75 trillion over a standard 10-year budget window.
$3 to $3.75 trillion.
Trillion, with a T.
That's an almost unimaginable amount of money from just 100,000 households. How does that compare to, say, total current federal income tax revenue?
Well, total federal revenue is roughly $4.55 trillion per year currently. So $3.75 trillion over 10 years averages out to $375 billion per year. That's a very significant chunk, maybe 6-8% of total federal revenues, potentially, enough to completely reshape federal spending priorities.
And where would that money go? What's the plan for using it?
The proposal ties the revenue to funding what they call the rebuilding the middle class agenda. Think universal childcare, student debt relief, significant investments in green infrastructure and clean energy, affordable housing, basically large-scale progressive policy goals.
Okay, so that's the official projection. Massive revenue for transformative programs. But there must be skeptics, right? Do other economists agree with that $3-4 trillion number?
Oh, absolutely not. Skepticism is rampant, especially from more centrist or conservative economists, and even some on the left. The critiques usually revolve around the assumptions baked into those Saez-Zucman models regarding evasion and compliance.
They think people will still find ways to avoid it, even with the $100 billion IRS budget and the exit tax.
Yes. They argue that the super wealthy are incredibly adept at tax avoidance, using sophisticated trusts, offshore structures, aggressive valuation techniques for hard-to-value assets, things that are difficult and costly for any tax authority to penetrate, even a well-funded one.
So who are some of the main skeptics and what kind of numbers do they project?
Well, one of the most prominent critics cited in the source material is Lawrence Summers, a former Treasury Secretary under Clinton, generally seen as more of a centrist Democrat. He, along with Natasha Sarin, another economist, published analyses suggesting the revenue would be far, far lower.
How much lower?
Their initial estimates were drastically lower, closer to perhaps $250 billion over the same 10-year period, maybe up to $500 billion in later revisions, but still nowhere near the $3 trillion plus figure.
Wait, $250 billion versus $3 trillion. That's not just a minor disagreement over assumptions. That's a difference of more than 10 times. How can estimates be that far apart?
It really boils down to fundamentally different beliefs about two things. First, the difficulty and effectiveness of valuing complex, non-market assets. And second, the behavioral response, how much effort and resources the wealthy will expend on avoidance and evasion, and how successful they'll be.
So Saez and Zucman are more optimistic about the IRS's ability to enforce it with the new tools and funding.
Exactly. They believe the strong enforcement mechanisms, the high audit rates, the exit tax, the increased transparency all combined will significantly deter evasion and allow for reasonably accurate valuations, leading to high compliance among the target group.
While Summers and others are more pessimistic,
They're much more skeptical. They assume much higher rates of successful avoidance through legal loopholes, aggressive tax planning, and potentially illegal evasion. They emphasize the immense difficulty in valuing things like private businesses, art, complex trusts. They argue that even with $100 billion more, the IRS will struggle against the best lawyers and accountants money can buy, and that the political will to aggressively pursue these individuals might wane over time. They also factor in a larger economic impact, potentially dampening investment or growth, which would further reduce the tax base.
so one side believes robust design and enforcement can overcome avoidance. The other believes the wealthy will always find a way around it. making the practical revenue much lower.
That's a pretty good summary of the core disagreement on the revenue potential, yes. It's a massive gap in expectations.
And this huge uncertainty about revenue, administration, and avoidance,
Yeah.
it all happens before we even get to the giant legal question mark, the Constitution.
The constitutional hurdle, yes. This looms over any federal wealth tax proposal.
We saw that Supreme Court case recently, Moore v. U.S., in 2024. Everyone was watching it, thinking it might settle the wealth tax question. Did it?
Not really, no. It turned out to be a much narrower decision. The court upheld a specific tax on realized foreign income held through corporations, but explicitly avoided ruling on the constitutionality of a tax on unrealized gains or a pure wealth tax like Warren's. They kicked the can down the road, basically.
So the fundamental constitutional question is still wide open.
Yeah.
And what is that question exactly?
It all comes down to a specific clause in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. It says that no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken.
Okay. Direct tax needs to be in proportion to the census, meaning apportioned among the states by population. What does that mean in practice?
Apportionment is the killer. It means that if, say, California has 12% of the U.S. population, then California residents collectively must pay 12% of the total revenue generated by that direct tax, regardless of whether 30% or 40% of the nation's billionaires actually live in California.
Whoa. So a state with a large population but relatively few billionaires, like maybe Florida or Texas now,
would have its residents footing a disproportionately large share of the national wealth tax bill, essentially subsidizing states with higher concentrations of wealth, like California or New York. It makes absolutely no sense for a modern tax based on individual wealth. It's completely impractical politically and administratively.
So if a wealth tax is deemed a direct tax by the Supreme Court, it's effectively dead on arrival because apportionment makes it unworkable.
Correct. That's why the entire constitutional debate hinges on whether a wealth tax is a direct tax in the first place.
What are the arguments? What's considered not a direct tax?
Well, the income tax, for example. The 16th Amendment explicitly gave Congress the power to levy taxes on incomes without apportionment among the several states. So income taxes are fine. Excise taxes, taxes on specific activities or privileges, like taxes on gasoline, cigarettes, or inheritances, are generally considered indirect taxes and don't require apportionment.
So the proponents of a wealth tax have to argue it's not a direct tax on property itself, but something else.
Exactly. That's the legal tightrope they have to walk. Legal scholars who support it, like Bruce Ackerman or Erwin Chemerinsky, make the case that a wealth tax isn't a tax on the property itself, like a traditional property tax on your house, which might be considered direct. Instead, they argue it's an excise tax.
An excise tax on what? The act of being wealthy.
Essentially, yes.
Oh.
An excise tax levied on the privilege of accumulating and holding such vast amounts of wealth within the U.S. economic and legal system, or the privilege of benefiting from the economic power and control that comes with that wealth. They frame it as a tax on an activity or a status, not on the underlying assets themselves.
That sounds like a subtle distinction.
It is subtle, but potentially constitutionally crucial. If the Supreme Court accepts this privilege or excise framing, then the wealth tax is considered indirect, apportionment doesn't apply, and it's likely constitutional.
But if the court looks at it and says, no, this walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a tax on the property itself, just like a state property tax, then it's a direct tax.
Then it's likely deemed a direct tax, requires apportionment, and the whole federal proposal collapses under its own administrative weight. It really could come down to how 5 or more justices interpret the historical meaning of direct tax and whether they buy the excise argument. It's a massive legal gamble.
Okay. So we have huge uncertainty about revenue, huge administrative challenges, and a giant constitutional question mark. Plus, the very real problem of forcing billionaires to sell assets they might want to keep control of, or selling into a down market just to pay the tax bill.
Yeah.
The liquidity problem.
Right. The forced fire sales. That's a major practical concern, both for the taxpayer and potentially for market stability if lots of people are forced sellers at the same time.
Which brings us to one of the most, well, creative and maybe even radical ideas proposed to try and sidestep some of these issues. The idea of paying the tax with stock instead of cash.
Ah, yes. the in-kind payment mechanism. This is a fascinating policy innovation that tries to tackle several problems at once.
So instead of a billionaire having to sell, say, $600 million worth of their company's stock on the open market to raise cash for their tax bill.
They would instead transfer an equivalent value of stock directly to the U.S. Treasury. But critically, it would typically be non-voting stock.
Non-voting, why is that important?
Because it addresses the founder control problem. A major objection from tech founders and entrepreneurs is that a wealth tax would force them to sell voting shares, diluting their control over the companies they build, potentially harming long-term vision and innovation. By paying with non-voting shares, they transfer the economic value without giving up control over corporate strategy.
Okay, so the founder keeps control, the government gets the value. What does the government do with all this non-voting stock in potentially hundreds of different companies? Just hold on to it.
No, that would be incredibly complex and politically fraught. The proposal envisions something much more ambitious. The government wouldn't just hold these disparate blocks of stock, it would place them into a newly created U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund, SWF.
A sovereign wealth fund?
Yeah.
Like the giant funds that countries like Norway or Singapore have?
Exactly like those. The model most often cited is Norway's massive government pension fund Global, which is worth something like $1.5 trillion today, funded by Norway's oil revenues.
So the U.S. would create its own SWF, seeded not by oil, but by these annual in-kind stock contributions from the wealthiest Americans.
That's the concept. The SWF would receive these non-voting shares, manage them professionally, likely diversifying the portfolio over time, investing for long-term growth, just like Norway's fund does.
This sounds almost elegant. It solves the liquidity problem for the taxpayer. No need for fire sales. It solves the control problem for founders. They keep voting shares. It potentially even helps with the constitutional problem, maybe, because the government is receiving property in kind rather than demanding cash derived from a direct tax.
That's certainly part of the appeal, and some legal scholars argue it might strengthen the constitutional case, framing it more like an in-kind contribution or exaction rather than a direct tax demanding cash, though that's still debated.
But wouldn't this create a different massive problem? Doesn't this mean the U.S. government effectively becomes a huge shareholder, albeit non-voting, in potentially hundreds of major American corporations? Isn't that like backdoor nationalization, or at least creeping government influence?
That is the absolute central criticism and fear surrounding the SWF idea, the specter of government interference, even passive ownership in the private sector. Proponents have tried to design safeguards against this.
What safeguards?
The main one is strict independence and mandate. The SWF would need to be managed by an independent, nonpartisan board, legally firewalled from political interference by Congress or the White House. Its sole mandate would be maximizing financial returns for the American public, not pursuing political or social goals through its shareholdings. It would act purely as a financial investor, like a giant pension fund.
So the fund managers wouldn't be showing up at shareholder meetings trying to influence CEO pay or environmental policy?
Theoretically, no. Especially with non-voting shares, their influence is already limited. The idea is passive, diversified, long-term financial management completely insulated from politics. Whether that firewall could truly hold in practice over decades is, of course, a major point of skepticism.
Okay, assuming it could work as designed, what's the ultimate payoff for the public? Why create this massive fund?
The potential payoff is twofold. First, long-term growth. Just like Norway's fund, it could grow into a massive national asset over time, providing a stable source of government revenue independent of annual tax collections. But the second, more politically potent idea is using the fund's returns to pay annual citizen dividends directly to every American.
Dividends, like Alaska does with its oil fund.
Ah,
Every resident gets a check.
exactly like that, but potentially on a national scale. Imagine every American receiving a check for, say, a few hundred or even $1,000 each year, representing their share of the returns generated by the nation's productive wealth held in the SWF.
Wow. That changes the politics entirely, doesn't it?
It attempts to, yes.
Yeah.
It shifts the narrative away from just taxing the rich, which can sound punitive, towards creating a citizens' ownership era where every American has a direct financial stake in the success of the nation's largest companies and overall economic productivity.
So if the companies in the SWF do well, everyone benefits directly through their dividend check. It aligns public interest with corporate success in a very tangible way.
That's the powerful political logic behind it. It aims to democratize capitalism's benefits, give everyone a sense of shared ownership, and build broad, durable public support for the system. Instead of wealth concentration generating resentment, it generates a widely shared return.
It's a fascinating, almost radical idea born from trying to solve the practical problems of a wealth tax. Pay in non-voting stock, put it in an independent SWF, pay out dividends to everyone.
It is. It's policy engineering trying to be very clever. Of course, the practical and political challenges of setting up such a fund, ensuring its independence, and managing it effectively would be absolutely enormous. But it's a key part of the conversation around making a federal wealth tax actually workable. So moving from these big, sometimes theoretical blueprints like Warren's plan or the SWF, we really need to get practical. If policymakers were to move forward, how do they avoid the mistakes of the past? Because, let's face it, several high-profile wealth taxes have been tried and have failed or been repealed in major European economies.
Right. France and Sweden are the ghosts that haunt this debate. What went wrong there, according to the source material? Why did they fail?
It usually boils down to a combination of factors, often interacting. Things like poor initial design, maybe setting the rates too high, which increases the incentive for evasion and flight. Also, weak enforcement and inadequate resources for the tax authorities. And crucially, allowing too many exemptions and loopholes, which narrows the base, makes it seem unfair, and reduces revenue. Political instability and changes in government also played a big role, especially in France.
So high rates, weak enforcement, loopholes, political backlash. A recipe for failure.
Pretty much. They triggered enough capital flight, or at least the perception of it, and enough administrative headaches and political opposition that they eventually became unsustainable. But the key takeaway shouldn't be wealth taxes are impossible. It should be badly designed or poorly implemented wealth taxes fail.
Okay, so if those are the failures, what do the successes look like? Are there countries where wealth taxes have worked and endured?
Yes, there are, and they offer really important lessons in that precise engineering we talked about. The classic example always cited is Switzerland.
Switzerland,
Yeah,
which we think of as a very pro-business, wealthy country. They have a wealth tax.
they do. And they've had forms of it continuously since the early 20th century, for over 100 years, all while maintaining one of the world's highest GDPs per capita and a reputation for financial stability.
How does the Swiss model work? What's their secret?
Several key features stand out. First, it's highly decentralized. The main wealth tax is levied at the cantonal level, like states in the US, and even sometimes at the municipal level. This allows for regional flexibility and tailoring to local economic conditions.
So different cantons can have different rates.
Yes. And critically, those rates are generally very low. This is maybe the most important lesson. We're not talking 2% or 6% like in the Warren proposal. Swiss cantonal wealth tax rates typically range from maybe 0.1% up to about 1% at the very high end, depending on the canton and the level of wealth.
0.1% to 1%. That's an order of magnitude lower than the U.S. proposals.
Exactly. And it applies to a relatively broad base of wealth, not just billionaires, although there are significant exemptions, especially for things like household goods and sometimes pension assets. This combination, broad base, very low rates, seems to be key to its durability.
Why? What does that combination achieve?
It creates predictability and high compliance. The low rates significantly reduce the incentive for aggressive tax evasion or costly relocation. It's seen more as a regular, manageable part of the tax system, like property taxes, that people factor into their long-term financial planning. It doesn't feel confiscatory. And because it's been stable for so long, administered locally, it generates less political opposition. It coexists with prosperity because it's designed not to kill the golden goose.
Lesson 1. Decentralized, broad base, low rates, predictability.
Mm-hmm.
Who else is doing it successfully? You mentioned Norway earlier with their sovereign wealth fund.
Right. Norway is another interesting model, often held up as an example of social capitalism working effectively. They've had a national wealth tax in various forms since way back in 1892.
Wow, even longer than Switzerland.
Yes. And again, the rate is relatively modest. It's around 1% annually today, maybe slightly more depending on the total wealth. And it's split between the national government and the municipalities. It also has a reasonably high exemption threshold, so it mainly affects the wealthier segment of the population.
And Norway also has that huge $1.5 trillion sovereign wealth fund built from oil money. How does the wealth tax relate to the fund?
That's the crucial context. The wealth tax isn't seen in isolation. It's perceived by Norwegians as part of a broader social contract. The nation's collective oil wealth is managed in the SWF for the benefit of current and future generations, funding pensions and government services. The annual wealth tax is seen as a parallel contribution from private fortunes towards maintaining their extensive social safety net and public investments.
So it fits into a culture of shared responsibility.
Very much so. And this points to another key factor for success: Public trust. The source material highlights that survey data shows something like 80% of Norwegians trust their government to handle taxes fairly and spend the money wisely. That high level of trust creates a strong culture of compliance. It's seen as a civic duty, part of being Norwegian, not just an unpleasant obligation.
Lesson 2. Modest rate, high trust, integrated into a broader social contract.
Okay. Any other examples?
Spain offers another angle. They have a national wealth tax called the patrimonio, which was actually abolished for a few years and then reintroduced in 2011 during the financial crisis.
Okay, what's notable about Spain's version?
The rates are progressive, ranging from about 0.2% up to 3.75% on very high wealth levels. But the key feature is significant regional flexibility. The national government sets the framework, but the autonomous regions, like states, have considerable power to modify it.
How so?
They can change the exemption levels, the deductions, and even the tax rates. Most notably, the region of Madrid has effectively set its wealth tax rate to 0 through a 100% deduction.
0. So Madrid uses its flexibility to basically opt out.
Exactly. They use it as a tool to attract wealthy individuals and capital to the region. Meanwhile, other regions, like Catalonia, maintain higher effective rates to fund their specific regional public services.
So Spain shows how a national framework can still allow for regional competition and adaptation.
Yes. It allows the tax to be tailored to different regional economic strategies and political preferences. It might lead to some internal tax competition within Spain, but it keeps the overall structure in place nationally.
Okay, so pulling the lessons together from Switzerland, Norway, and Spain, what's the overarching message for designing a successful wealth tax?
The clear message is that success hinges almost entirely on the details of the design, not just the ideology behind it. The durable models tend to share characteristics like relatively low rates, a broad base, fewer loopholes, strong but fair enforcement, predictability over time, and often some element of decentralization or flexibility, and critically, embedding it within a system that generates public trust. Get the engineering right, and it can work. Get it wrong, make it too aggressive, too complex, too easy to dodge, and it's likely to fail.
Right, it needs to be meticulously engineered. Which brings us to the specific technical problems, the frictions, that critics always, and often rightly, raise. Let's tick through them and the proposed solutions from the toolbox.
Okay. We can probably group these frictions into a few main categories. There's the founder-controlled dilution issue we touched on. There's the illiquidity pain forcing fire sales. There are the valuation headaches for complex assets. And then there are the leverage games people borrowing against assets to avoid showing net worth or to pay the tax.
All right, let's start with founder control. We talked about paying with non-voting shares. Is that the main solution?
It's seen as the most elegant solution, yes. The in-kind payment using non-voting shares, potentially deposited into that U.S. sovereign wealth fund. This directly addresses the concern that founders would lose control of their companies.
Are there other mechanisms proposed to protect founder control?
Yes, policymakers could also implement specific control-preserving thresholds. For example, the rules could state that voting shares held by a founder are exempt from the tax, or taxed at a much lower rate, up to the point where they hold a controlling interest, say, 51% of the voting stock.
So the value above the control threshold would be taxed normally, but the shares needed for control are protected.
Something like that. The goal is to tax the economic value of the wealth without disrupting the governance structure that might be crucial for the company's long-term success. It's a pragmatic concession to the unique role of founders.
Okay, that handles control. Now, illiquidity. This seems huge.
Sure.
What about the billionaire whose wealth is mostly tied up in, say, illiquid real estate, or a massive private art collection, or a family-owned business that can't easily be sold? Forcing them to sell chunks of that quickly, especially in a bad market, seems really damaging.
It absolutely is. It's not only painful for the taxpayer, but potentially destabilizing for those specific asset markets, think art market crashes or distressed real estate sales. And it's pro-cyclical, forcing sales when prices are already low. So the toolbox needs robust solutions here.
What's proposed?
Two main tools: multi-year smoothing and deferral options.
Smoothing, how does that work?
Instead of basing the tax on the asset's value on one specific day each year, which could catch a temporary peak or trough, you'd average the assessed value over several years, say 3 to 5 years. This smooths out short-term market volatility and provides a more stable, predictable tax base.
Okay, that helps avoid taxing temporary bubbles or dips. What about the deferral?
This is crucial for genuinely illiquid assets. The proposal is to offer taxpayers a generous deferral option. They could elect to defer paying a significant portion maybe up to 80% of their annual wealth tax liability for a set period, perhaps 5 or even 10 years.
They don't pay it for a decade.
They don't pay it immediately. The deferred tax liability would still accrue interest at a transparent government rate, say the T-bill rate plus a small margin. And crucially, the government would secure its claim by placing a federal lien on the underlying illiquid assets.
Ah, a lien.
Yeah.
So the government has a legal claim on the property if the tax isn't eventually paid.
Exactly. The tax gets paid eventually, perhaps when the asset is sold, or upon the owner's death, or when the deferral period ends. But it prevents the need for forced fire sales in the short term. It allows the asset to remain productive or be sold in an orderly manner. It turns the immediate liquidity problem into a manageable long-term financing issue.
That sounds like a really necessary safety valve. Okay, smoothing and deferral for illiquidity. Next headache. Valuation. How do you realistically price that private company or the unique art piece or the complex hedge fund stake every single year without drowning the IRS and the taxpayer in appraisal costs and disputes?
This requires moving away from bespoke, individualized appraisals for everything, which is just unworkable at scale. The key idea is simplification through standardization, primarily using safe harbor tables.
Safe harbor tables, what are those?
For assets like stakes in privately held businesses that aren't publicly traded, instead of requiring a complex business valuation every year, the IRS would publish industry-specific safe harbor tables. These tables would provide standard valuation multiples like a software company of this size is typically valued at 5 times its annual revenue or 10 times its EBITDA based on objective financial metrics for that particular sector.
So the taxpayer just looks up their industry, plugs in their company's revenue or earnings, and uses the standard multiple.
Essentially, yes. It provides a simple, predictable, and relatively easy-to-administer way to estimate the value based on industry averages. It dramatically reduces the need for costly, contentious, bespoke appraisals.
Could a taxpayer argue the safe harbor value is wrong for their specific company?
The system would likely allow a taxpayer to elect for a formal, independent appraisal if they believe the safe harbor significantly overvalues their stake. But importantly, if they choose that path, they might be required to stick with that more complex and costly appraisal methodology for a set number of years to prevent cherry picking. The default would be the simpler safe harbor.
Okay, safe harbors for private firms. What about other weird assets, art, collectibles, crypto?
Similar principles. For certain categories, you might use standardized indices or recent sales data, but critically, you also need materiality thresholds. Meaning the IRS shouldn't waste time trying to value every single painting or sculpture someone owns. The rules would likely set a high threshold, say, ignore individual artworks or collectibles valued below $250,000 or maybe even higher. The focus of the audits and valuation efforts should be squarely on the major assets, the billion-dollar stock portfolios, the controlling interest in large private companies, the huge real estate holdings, not the small stuff. Pareto principle. Focus on the 20% of assets that represent 80% or more of the value.
Simplify, standardize, and ignore the small stuff. Makes sense. Okay, last friction. Leverage games. How do you stop people from just borrowing heavily against their assets to artificially reduce their net worth, or borrowing to pay the tax itself in a way that games the system?
This is tricky. Some level of debt is legitimate, of course, but you need rules to prevent abuse. This might involve limits on the deductibility of certain types of debt, especially non-recourse loans taken out seemingly just before the assessment date, or loans from related parties or offshore entities. You also need robust anti-abuse rules that give the IRS authority to look through transactions that appear designed solely to minimize the wealth tax. It requires careful legal drafting and vigilant enforcement. Borrowing to pay might be allowed under the deferral rules, but secured by the lien.
Okay, so non-voting shares for control, smoothing and deferral for illiquidity, safe harbors and thresholds for valuation, and anti-abuse rules for leverage. It sounds like there's a technical fix for most of the economic frictions, if designed carefully.
The consensus among policy experts who've studied this seems to be, yes, the purely technical challenges are largely solvable with smart, detailed policy engineering. The toolbox exists.
Which inevitably brings us to the final and perhaps biggest hurdle.
The politics. We've established that the economic arguments for a wealth tax, based on ragey dollar and revenue needs, are strong. We've seen that the technical design challenges, while complex, have plausible solutions drawn from global experience and policy innovation. And yet,
wealth taxes keep failing to get enacted, or they get repealed, even in places where they seem popular.
Exactly. We have to confront this political reality. Why does this policy, which consistently polls very well, sources mention 60 to 70% support among Americans, often including over 50% of Republicans supporting higher taxes on billionaires, face such immense political obstacles?
It's a fascinating paradox.
Yeah.
Popular idea, political non-starter, often. Why?
I think one of the sources we looked at put it really powerfully. It drew a distinction. Wealth tax advocates tend to fight a debate.
Armed with data, charts, economic models, fairness arguments.
Precisely. They come prepared to debate the merits, the design, the economic impacts. But their opponents, they often fight a power struggle, meaning they aren't necessarily interested in engaging on the factual merits or the nuances of policy design. Their goal is often to shift the terrain entirely, to frame the proposal in ways that trigger fear, resentment, or tribal political loyalties, regardless of the facts. They use political power, influence, and narrative control to simply make the idea toxic or politically untouchable.
So it's not about winning the argument on points, it's about poisoning the well.
That's often the dynamic, yes.
Yeah.
Look at the pattern of defeat we've seen historically, both here and abroad. Senator Warren's proposal, as we mentioned, meticulously drafted, supported by Nobel-winning economists, it never even got a floor vote in the Senate. Why not?
Why not?
Because the immediate counterattack wasn't about the details of the 6% rate or the valuation methods. It was pure political framing. Opponents successfully branded it as socialism, class envy, punishing success, and attack on the American dream. It was framed as political theater, not serious policy, designed to mobilize a base and scare off moderates. The actual substance of the plan barely got discussed in the mainstream political arena.
The conversation was shut down before it really began.
Exactly. And look at France's experience with their wealth tax, the ISF, Impôt de solidarité sur la fortune. It was actually a fairly modest tax, rates around 1.5% at the top. But how was it killed?
How?
Conservative politicians and a largely sympathetic media relentlessly branded it as anti-business and job killing. They amplified every single anecdote, often exaggerated, of a millionaire or entrepreneur supposedly fleeing to lower tax Belgium or Switzerland because of the ISF.
Even if the actual numbers on capital flight were debatable?
Even if the data was complex or showed flight was limited, the perception was cultivated that France was driving away its wealth creators. That narrative, repeated often enough, became the political reality. The policy was successfully framed as economically damaging and politically toxic, leading directly to its repeal in 2018 under President Macron. It wasn't the economics that ultimately killed the ISF. It was the relentless negative narrative.
And Sweden. You mentioned their tax was scrapped in 2007. Similar story.
Very similar tactics. Sweden's wealth tax had been around for decades. But when right-wing parties campaigned against it, they didn't focus primarily on the impact on billionaires. Instead, they cleverly reframed it as a middle-class issue.
How? If the thresholds were high.
They focused on the fact that the tax base included the value of primary residences above a certain threshold. So the killer argument became, why should ordinary Swedes have to pay tax on their family home twice, once through property taxes and then again through the wealth tax?
Even if very few middle-class homes actually reach the wealth tax threshold.
Precisely. Even though the tax overwhelmingly affected the top 1% or so, the narrative successfully convinced many middle-class voters that they were potentially next, or that the principle was unfair. It created anxiety and broke the broad political coalition needed to sustain the tax. Again, the debate was lost because the story told by opponents was more effective than the statistical reality presented by proponents.
This really highlights the effectiveness of the opposition's tactics, doesn't it? Tactics of avoidance and misdirection.
Absolutely. They often don't need to disprove the core idea that taxing extreme wealth could raise significant revenue or reduce inequality. They just need to poison the conversation.
How? What are the main tactics you see?
Several recurring ones. Ignoring the facts and the data entirely. Using personal attacks against the proponents. They're socialists, they're envious, they don't understand business. Weaponizing fear. This tax will destroy jobs. Investment will flee the country. They're coming for your house next. Often without credible evidence. And crucially, leveraging complexity.
Complexity kills.
Complexity kills in politics. Wealth taxes, as we've discussed, are inherently complex to design well. You need rules for valuation, liquidity, control, international assets. The details matter enormously. But that complexity is also a political vulnerability.
Because it's hard to explain easily.
Exactly. If the policy, with all its necessary technical, fixes the deferrals, the liens, the safe harbors, the non-voting shares, the SWF cannot be explained and defended in a simple, clear, emotionally resonant way. It gets lost. Opponents can easily caricature it, sow confusion, and claim it's too complicated, it'll never work, it's just a big government grab.
So the message needs to be crystal clear. Something like,
Something like a small contribution from the very largest fortunes to ensure our healthcare system doesn't collapse, or asking billionaires to pay their fair share so we can invest in education and opportunity for everyone. Or maybe, with the SWF idea, turning billionaire wealth into citizen dividends for all Americans. It needs a simple, compelling, positive frame that cuts through the fear and complexity.
if you're explaining, you're losing in politics.
Often, yes, the proponents need a narrative that's as powerful and simple as the opposition's narrative of fear.
Which brings us back really to the fundamental issue underlying this whole deep dive. It's about wealth accountability in the 21st century.
That's the bedrock issue. Is the goal punishment? No. Proponents would argue the goal is reciprocity.
Reciprocity.
Yes. The idea that immense private wealth is built upon a foundation of public goods, educated workforces, infrastructure, legal systems, stable markets, scientific research funded by taxpayers. Therefore, there's a reciprocal obligation for that wealth to contribute back to sustaining and enhancing those public goods. It's about ensuring prosperity is viewed and treated as a shared public good, not just a private one.
And the true stakes, then, are not just economic, but democratic.
Deeply democratic. The ultimate question is whether a democratic system can remain healthy and responsive to its citizens when extreme concentrations of private wealth inevitably translate into extreme concentrations of political influence through lobbying, campaign finance, media ownership, funding think tanks. When RG dollar also means returns on political influence are greater than growth of democratic accountability. Can democracy survive that dynamic?
So if a wealth tax or something like it is ever going to succeed politically in the U.S.,
the advocates need to learn from past failures. They need to campaign like political organizers, not just like academic economists. They need to build broad coalitions, anticipate the attack lines, and frame the issue not as class warfare, but as basic fairness, civic duty, maybe even patriotism. And crucially, they need to make the benefits tangible and visible to the average person, whether it's lower healthcare costs, better schools, or maybe even that citizen dividend check from a sovereign wealth fund. The what's in it for me needs to be clear.
wow, okay. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. It feels like a journey.
It definitely does.
We started right in the thick of it, with that specific immediate crisis response brewing in California, that one-time 5% levy on billionaires, driven by healthcare unions, trying to stave off a potential $30 billion cut to Medi-Cal, a real political earthquake.
From the state-level emergency fix.
We zoomed out to the big, theoretical national model, focusing on Elizabeth Warren's ambitious plan. Annual rates up to 6%, targeting global wealth, backed by that $100 billion IRS enforcement surge and the aggressive 40% exit tax. And we explore that fascinating, novel idea of paying in non-voting stock to fund a U.S. sovereign wealth fund paying citizen dividends.
The grand systemic vision.
And then we got down to the brass tacks. We looked at the practical, nitty-gritty engineering required for success, drawing lessons from places like Switzerland and Norway that have made wealth taxes endure the importance of low rates, broad bases, predictability, and trust. And we detailed that whole toolbox of fixes for the technical frictions. Non-voting shares, smoothing, deferral with liens, safe harbors, materiality thresholds, trailing liability.
All designed to make it workable, to counter the legitimate economic concerns and avoid the pitfalls that doomed earlier attempts. It really underscores the main tension. Success demands incredible precision and design. Be too aggressive, like maybe France was perceived to be, and you risk triggering that capital exodus and political backlash. But be too timid, or riddle it with loopholes, and you fail to address the underlying structural inequality driven by Shlik, and you don't raise meaningful revenue. Finding that sweet spot, that durable, effective design that requires not just technical skill, but real political courage.
It really feels like a pivotal moment. If you accept the premise that the 20th century was largely defined fiscally by the rise of progressive income taxes and the building of social safety nets, then this whole debate suggests the defining fiscal challenge of the 21st century might be wealth accountability. How do societies grapple with these unprecedented, rapidly accumulating, often passive fortunes generated by capital?
That seems to be the core question emerging globally. If the economic and philosophical arguments for some form of wealth taxation are gaining ground, the focus now shifts entirely to the how. How do you design it technically? And just as importantly, how do you navigate the treacherous political waters to actually implement it, make it stick?
Which leaves us, and you, our listeners, with a final thought to chew on.
Okay, so here it is, building on that idea. If the 20th century successfully established income taxes and social insurance as pillars of modern society, the 21st century seems destined to grapple with the challenge of wealth accountability. The truly provocative question you need to consider, reflecting on everything we've unpacked today, is this. How do we ensure that in the richest, most technologically advanced nation on Earth, immense prosperity ultimately serves and strengthens democracy, and not the other way around?